I'm Chuck Missler, and I'm glad to be with you once again. We published a series of briefings called the Vortex strategy a decade and a half ago, partly motivated by my personal background from the intelligence community and also my time on Wall Street. It was a focus of our ministry very early. And in view of the uncertain times that we seem to be heading into, we felt it would be appropriate to review some of these ideas again, which we call the Vortex strategy. And this first session will focus primarily on the predicament that you and I appear to be facing. And there's great uncertainty on Wall Street. Are we going for hyperinflation, deflation? There's instability in our political world. There's instability in our financial world. And all of this puts pressures on us as individuals and heads of family as to what to do about it. So we're going to focus into this. Now, most of you may realize that one of the distinctives of our ministry has been not only expositional Bible studies, holding a very high view of inspiration, but also our focus on strategic trends. We draw our motivation from 1 Chronicles 12:32. We want to be like the sons of Issachar, which were men who had understanding of the times and knew what their country had to do. And it's on that basis we focus on this, and we have for more than a decade or two focused on strategic trends, the primary major trends that constitute the main subjects of intelligence gathering by virtually every major intelligence agency on the planet Earth. But they hold our attention because they each have biblical relevance. Weapons technology, biotech and global pestilence, the struggle for Jerusalem. Strangely, that's a category of intelligence gathering by every major intelligence agency on the planet Earth. And of course, the rise of Islam, the imminent Magog invasion, the rise of Asia, the rise of a European superstate, global governance, ecumenical religion, and of course the specific challenges for America. These trends are the subject of an annual review, and we've recently published these reviews, and what you're going to see in this session is just a few of the highlights from some of these, particularly the ones that will impact our personal stewardship, which of course we'll deal with in the second session, specifically what we should do about these things. So let's start, though, with a focus on our situation right here in America this year. First question I'd like to ask is, where is the most dangerous place for an American to be? And the answer, of course, is in the mother's womb. There's 1 chance in 4 of being murdered. We need to understand the context that we find ourselves in as a country for a lot of different reasons. We have before us a legacy of despair. 48 million abortions since Roe versus Wade in 1973. We have a Social Security system that's going broke primarily because of the lack of input of young talent. If we hadn't murdered those 48 million Americans, they would have gone to school, they'd be starting families, they'd be filling the hole in our workforce that would have allowed Social Security to be continued. Over 1.6 million abortions per year, over 4,000 per day, and on it goes. Whenever you think of this, I want you to remember the ministry of John the Baptist, who started his ministry when he was 9 inches long, weighed 1.5 pounds, and he was the mother's womb. He was spirit-filled and jumped for joy. Our stock indexes are at unprecedented highs. As we check today, it's higher than ever, so it must be a wonderful time. The people are buying their 3rd and 4th cars. Almost every home has a computer. It's hard to find anyone without a phone growing out of his ear. Fuel costs less than the water we drink. So in the minds of many, it's the best of times, but not so to those that are spiritually sensitive. If we take an index of our leading cultural indicators over the last 3 decades, 560% increase in violent crime, 400% increase in illegitimate births, 400% increase in the divorce rate, 300% increase in single-parent homes, 200% increase in teenage suicides. The only thing going down are the SAT scores. Oh, this is from the Heritage Foundation. We are a nation in peril. We lead the industrialized world in murder, rape, and violent crime. In elementary and secondary education, we're near the bottom of the achievement scores worldwide. There's a coarseness, a callousness, a cynicism, banality, and vulgarity signaling the decivilization of our nation. Every day in America, there are almost 3,000 teenage pregnancies per day, over 1,000 teen abortions per day. Over 4,000 teenagers contract a sexually transmitted disease per day. every 64 seconds, a baby will be born to a teenage mother, and 5 minutes later, a baby will have been born to a teenager who already has a child. And on it goes. You see, we murder babies that are socially inconvenient. We change marriage partners like a fashion statement. Homosexuality is just an alternate lifestyle. We've abandoned the sanctity of relationships, not just in our marriages, but in our businesses. That brings us to the two most frequent questions I get asked as I travel across the country. In virtually every venue that we speak to, there's a question and answer opportunity. And the two questions we can always predict will come up from an enlightened audience. The first one is, where is the United States in prophecy? Everybody wonders about that. There are all kinds of conjectures around. But it's clear that we're conspicuous in our absence of mention. The second question we get asked, which is almost the inverse of that, but a close cousin of that, is why hasn't God judged America? Billy Graham got the great quip off, great soundbite years ago. He says, if God doesn't judge America, he'll have to apologize to Sodom and Gomorrah. Thomas Jefferson said essentially the same thing back in 1781. He says, I tremble for my country when I recall that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever. So I'd like to highlight our present predicament in about 4 scenarios. We don't have time to go through all the things of our strategic briefings. We encourage you to look at those where you can, but I'll highlight just 4 scenarios that confront us here in America as we speak. The first one I'll characterize by Ezekiel 39, verse 6. What am I getting at? Well, if we study the what famed Magog invasion, that's the passage in Ezekiel 38 and 39, it speaks of what appears to be an imminent invasion by Russia and her allies of the Middle East. And Ezekiel 38 and 39 is so famous for 2 reasons. First reason, it's the occasion in which God himself intervenes to quell this ill-fated invasion of Israel by Magog and a group of allies that are there detailed in Ezekiel 38. The second reason it's so well known among most Bible buffs, appears to describe the use of nuclear weapons. Now, why do I say that? Well, first, the identity. Who is Magog? Well, fortunately, Hesiod, an 8th century didactic poet, also Herodotus, a 5th century a guy known as the father of history, both of them clearly identify the descendants of Magog as being the Scythians, which, of course, is the forebear of the true Russian. Philo, Josephus, and other writers speak of the Great Wall of China as the ramparts of Gog and Magog. That's what it was built for, to keep Magog out. The Soviet archaeologists have revealed all kinds of background of their roots in terms of the kurgans, these frozen tombs in Siberia that are 2,000 to 3,000 years old. But if you don't know all that, it's still easy to figure out who Magog is because the Bible says he comes from the uttermost parts of the north. Well, what's north of Israel? Obviously, the southern steppes of Russia and the land of Magog, if you will. So without getting into all the details of this passage, it becomes clear to any serious student that the Magog invasion appears to be imminent. It appears ready to happen. All but one of the allies, they're detailed, are in place. The one that's missing is Turkey. So watch Turkey as it swings from over 80 years of trying to be part of the West to swinging back to an Eastern orientation and participating in this. Meanwhile, Russia is moving its Black Sea fleet from Odessa into the Eastern Mediterranean. And furthermore, Iran is installing its medium-range ballistic missiles, the Saab-3s, in the Syrian highlands, and Russia is surrounding them with their highly venerated air defense. And while all that's going on, we're dispatching the 3rd carrier to the 5th Fleet into the Gulf region. The USS Enterprise, the first nuclear-powered carrier, is joining the 2 that are already there. Well, the reason we get into this here in this context is because of a troubling verse in chapter 39 of Ezekiel. In verse 6, it previously has said in the passage that God is going to put hailstones of fire on top of Magog and his allies. But when you get to verse 6, God says, I will send a fire on Magog and among them that dwell carelessly in the isles or coastlands. And they shall know that I am the Lord. Now, that term carelessly, by the way, in the Hebrew is batash, which really means in false confidence, carelessly or in false confidence. Now, the question is, who are these people? They're not the allies of Magog have already been dealt with, but somehow there's this little footnote, so to speak, that there's some bystanders that they're not attacking nor defending, apparently. They're but they're going to also get fire on them. And the speculation by some students is that possibly it's the U.S. missiles that God uses to wipe out the invading forces, but that triggers a response into an exchange. And that while Russia and her allies are moving against Israel, there's a brinksmanship, somewhat analogous to the 13-day episode of Cuba, except something goes wrong, and it results in an actual exchange. And so that accomplishes the purpose that God has in quelling that invasion on the one hand, but it's speculated by some that possibly the hitting the U.S. with nuclear missiles may be a form of judgment. But let's take the second scenario. It has to do with Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, of course, has dropped their big shoe on September 11th of 2001, and everybody's been apprehensive since. There have been incidents of all kinds, but not the big one. There's all kinds of rumbles in the intelligence community that Al-Qaeda is planning a major sequel. And what could that be? Well, let's understand there's no shortage of financing. Al-Qaeda has financing, production, distribution, and acquisitions that are tracking by our law enforcement and agencies. And let's talk about the financing. On the street in New Jersey, you can find a binny. That is, what is it named after? Bin Laden. It's a new grade, a higher grade, the highest grade of heroin on the street, now known as number 4. And it's the finest in the world, 71.4% pure, 10 per bundle. Most of it comes from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, the so-called Golden Crescent. What bin Laden has done, he's recruited the best chemists he could find in Pakistan, China, and the former Soviet Union. He established laboratories to upgrade heroin from the number 3 to the number 4 grade. He's introduced a whole new grade. And with that, now controls over 90% of the heroin trade on the planet Earth. The Taliban earned between 5 and 16 billion, that's with a B, in the late 90s. And in 1998, we understand there's 149,000 new users in the U.S. alone, 80% under the age of 26. Costs a couple $100 a day to maintain the habit, which means they turn to crime. In 2004, the UN reports over a 60% increase per year in the acreage that's yielding this product. Let's talk about nuclear materials. There's plenty of money. See, we understand that bin Laden has no shortage of cash. In fact, George Tenet, the former director of the CIA, has indicated his opinion that there's little doubt that many al-Qaeda nukes are presently already in the United States. And that's obviously of concern to all of us. Now, the Department of Homeland Security has officially declared the following: Americans should prepare for the inevitability of a nuclear event sometime in the future. So it's a question of when, not if. Well, in this spirit, though, I have to throw in one little quote that I get a big kick out of by none other than Jay Leno. He had, on one of his shows, he had a great line. He says, with hurricanes, tornadoes, fires out of control, mudslides, flooding, severe thunderstorms tearing up the country from one end to another, and with a threat of the bird flu and terrorist attacks, are we sure this is a good time to take God out of the Pledge of Allegiance? Well said. Well, let's move on. The third scenario is the one that concerns me personally the most. And I have reason to suspect, for reasons I can't disclose, that it's probably the number one priority of the Homeland Security people. And what am I talking about? Well, let's talk a little bit about Iran. Let's realize that Iran's medium-range ballistic missiles already can reach Europe and certainly shower the Middle East. This is the picture of the reactor at Bushehr that's in the news so much, Iran's nuclear program. But this is just a cover operation. This is a picture of the Majlis in October of more than a year ago, 2 years ago. The Majlis is their parliament. There are 290 members. In this picture, 247 of the 290 are voting for the nuclear program. But what's interesting is the way they voted. They stood, raised their fist, and said, death to the United States, death to Israel. I think the order is interesting. And the president of Iran has made it very clear what his strategy is. He is in a rush. He feels God called to create the disturbance that will usher in the last imam and all of their eschatological expectations. Well, in this sense, there is a technology that I think is important for every one of us that take our families seriously to understand. It's called electromagnetic pulse. EMP is the abbreviation. It's a two-word, electromagnetic is one word, but you can't explain engineers. It's a three-letter abbreviation, EMP. Back in 1962 in the Pacific atomic tests, there was a series called Starfish. They launched one 400 kilometers over Johnston Island, 1.4 megaton warhead. Virtually almost 1,000 miles away in Hawaii, street lights were blown out, alarms tripped, damaged telecommunication facilities. That's where they began to discover that one of the side effects of a very high altitude nuclear blast is an extremely intense magnetic pulse, a damaging pulse. It disrupted navigation in Australia for 18 hours. The Soviets in their tests learned the same thing. They even had buried power cables that were burned out from these tests. That's what led to the United States and the Soviet Union to enter into a treaty of no more high-altitude bursts, because they realized that it creates unforeseen damage. Still, that's when they went to all the underground testing, that sort of thing. But what you need to understand, there is a report that was impaneled by the Congress. They created a commission specifically to assess the threat to the United States from an electromagnetic pulse attack. This commission published its report in July of 2004, and it's available today on the internet. You can read it. If you launch a nuclear weapon at 100 miles or more above the center of the United States, that magnetic pulse that it creates is line of sight in all directions, and it would reach virtually coast to coast, frying the circuits connected to any long wire. Not just disabling for a while, destroying them. And so, the vulnerability, we've always known that Israel is a one-bomb country. One nuke over Tel Aviv and that story is over, it would seem. The shock of this commission was to realize that the United States is a one-bomb country. Not in terms of direct damage, but in terms of plunging it back to the 19th century. Just one bomb delivered at a high altitude could plunge the United States back into the 19th century. It would destroy telecommunications, not just for a few hours, permanently. It would thus destroy power, and not just for a few hours. Imagine the major cities without power. How do you send an ambulance downtown if there's gridlock because the signals aren't working? At Katrina, we discovered you can't pump gas out of a gas station if there's no power to pump it. Visualize our major cities with no water, no food, no sanitation, and by the way, no law enforcement. The other insight of the commission was that once something like this happens, there's no way to install a recovery plan. Whatever recovery plan you may conjure up has to be installed before it happens, because the very effect of it would eliminate your ability to do that. Well, by the way, let me give you a small modification of this. You don't have to get that nuke over the center of the United States. Visualize an unmarked container ship that is approaching the U.S. coast, and it doesn't have to get closer than a few hundred miles before, from that container ship, you launch a Sahab 3, a standard off-the-shelf Sahab 3, that could easily get to Cincinnati or Indianapolis. You don't care about accuracy, you care about altitude. And once you launch it, you don't cover the whole United States. But if you look at the United States, this map at night, you'll get the idea. You would cover about 70% of the population, one bomb. That population would be plunged back to 19th century technologies. And it would take the United States out of the game as a major player, because you're destroying the electronics in Washington, D.C., in New York, Boston, you make the list. What's the current status? According to insider briefings that we've been privy to, it appears in the minds of many that Iran will have a nuclear capability in a matter of months, not years. And the sooner they have that, Ahmadinejad has made it clear what he's going to do with it. Iran is currently practicing a strange maneuver. They're launching Sahab 3 medium-range ballistic missiles from container ships in the Caspian Sea and detonating them at altitude. And Jane's intelligence services surmises that what they're doing is practicing EMP attacks. They're practicing as we speak. Well, let's shift gears here. We've talked about Magog, Al-Qaeda, EMPs. Let's talk about something even closer to home, the impending monetary crisis here in America. The U.S. dollar, 2/3 of world trade is conducted at the moment in dollars. Over 70% of the central bank's currency reserves throughout the world are held in U.S. dollars. It's the sole currency used by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and so on. This has conferred on the United States an economic advantage. It means that we have the ability to run a trade deficit each year because people are willing to lend us dollars. And the reason they do that is because foreign countries need dollars to repay their debts to the IMF, to conduct international trade, and to build up their own currency reserves. That's the status so far. A move away from the dollar towards, say, the euro or any one of the other currencies could have a disastrous effect on the U.S. economy, as the U.S. would no longer be able to spend beyond its means. Worse still, the U.S. would then be forced to become a net currency importer, as foreigners would seek to spend their dollars in the U.S., and that's a large portion of the $3 trillion that they currently carry. Furthermore, the U.S. would be forced to have a trade surplus. That would be if we had one, it'd be the first time in over 100 years, providing more goods and services than we get in return. So a rapid and wholesale move, say to the euro or one of the other currencies, could lead to a dollar crash as everyone tried to get rid of some or all of their U.S. dollars at the same time. Now, unfortunately, that's not the outcome that either Europe, Russia, or China are seeking, because they all have so many dollar assets, they would hope that the crash would be a soft landing. Except my experience with traders on the street, once they see a need, there's a race for the exits. So we'll see. The soft landing would not be in anyone's interest, except perhaps Islam's. So we should keep an eye on that one. How does it all come about? Well, the oil exporters, up till about 1950, we were a major oil exporter. That all changed as we started to consume more than we produced. And sales of oil and natural gas up till then had been exclusively denominated in dollars. And because we accounted for more than half of the annual oil production. But the tendency to price in dollars was additionally reinforced by a conference in 1944 called Bretton Woods, which established the dollar for the IMF and the World Bank and so on. In 1944, 44 countries created the International Monetary Fund. They also established what we call the gold exchange standard, that banks could exchange their dollars for gold. And on that basis, they all agreed to lock their currencies to the U.S. dollar. That all sounded pretty good until about 1971, when Nixon realized that there was 5 times as many claims on dollars and gold as there was gold in Fort Knox. So he did the only thing he could do, he shut the gold window. He simply abrogated that commitment. And so in August 71, at this point, all the bankers in the world were stuck. What are they going to do, go to war with the United States? No. They had to swallow hard, but now their dollars were only as good, but they were backed by only the reputation of the U.S. government, nothing tangible. So there's a quiet game going on, because while the denomination of oil sales is not a subject that is normal conversation in most family circles, it is well understood by governments and large corporations. In 1971, when Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard, OPEC considered shifting its contracts into euros. But what we did is we did a deal with Saudi Arabia in the hopes that if we could lock them up, that everybody else would follow. We guaranteed Saudi Arabia's defense in exchange for keeping the dollar the form of denomination. And that's exactly what they called in Desert Storm when we had the Kuwait thing took place. It was basically making good that treaty arrangement. So what the Saudis did, of course, OPEC followed. Now the think tanks are warning us. Countries switching to euro reserves from dollar reserves will bring down the value of the U.S. currency. Imports would start to cost Americans a lot more. As countries and businesses convert their dollar assets into euro assets, the U.S. property and stock market bubbles would, without a doubt, burst. And that's just typical of many of the think tanks that are tracking this possibility. Now, what's interesting, China is doing perhaps the most interesting thing. See, the dollar's position is already on decline in many countries. That's the opinion of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. China's doing something interesting. They are building gigantic storage tanks, and they're starting to put their reserves not into anyone's currency, but into black gold, as some people call it, oil. And they're diversifying their foreign exchange holdings into oil, and these tanks have another year or two to go before they're completed. But interesting. But it's already starting. On January of this year, Kuwait announced that they're considering abandoning pegging its dinar to the dollar for fear of anticipated slide in the value of the dollar. Everybody's starting to recognize the dollar is shaky. The central banks of Italy, Russia, Sweden, and United Arab Emirates have announced similar shifts out of the dollar into other currencies or gold, citing the United States' twin deficits, and I'll come to that in a minute, and as the reason for the fall in the value of the dollar. Bush and the current Congress, get this now, have authorized and borrowed more money from foreign governments, banks and other companies and citizens than all of the previous 42 U.S. administrations combined. Add up all the borrowings before they took up offering in the history of this country, and they borrowed more. See, from 1776 to the year 2000, the first 224 years of our history, 42 presidents borrowed a combined $1.01 trillion from foreign governments and financial institutions. That's according to the Treasury Department. In the last 4 years alone, the Bush administration has borrowed 1.05, slightly more than all that put together. But let's talk about something else. Let's talk about trade balance. We buy more than we sell. We always have. We finance our purchases with debt currency. Our current imbalance in the deficit is over $850 billion per year. It's a big number. Let's take a look at this. When we first started publishing our Vortex strategy materials in the early 90s, we were facing about a $100 billion negative trade balance and thought that was something to be concerned over. And as the years went on, it started to get really worse by a factor of 4 to 1. Started to improve a little bit in the year 2000, 2001. But guess what happened subsequently? It grows and grows. It is now 8 times what it was when we were concerned back in the early 90s. Or last year, $850 billion. Almost $1 trillion a year. Now let's talk a different thing. Let's talk about the government itself, its debt. The Bush administration is forecasting that the federal deficit for 2007 budget year will be $244 billion. That's a little better than it was last year if they make it, but they probably won't. So as we look, you see, since the government spends more than it takes in revenue, they finance their operations with debt. So let's take a look at the dilemma of the U.S. Treasury today. The federal deficit is about $250 billion, let's round it off, $250 billion a year. The trade deficit internationally is $850 billion a day. That means we have a deficit requirement. We need to borrow $1.1 trillion per year. That's $3 billion per day. Per day. I'm going to be very interested to see who's willing to pick up those notes as time goes on here. Let's talk about the consumer. Let's just take one thing, mortgage debt. It startled me to realize that the mortgage debt has also been growing to where it approximates the federal debt. Can you imagine? Growing, growing, growing. No savings rate in this country. Everybody thinks their savings is the equity of their homes, not realizing that that's a derived number. Let's talk about foreclosures. They're starting to escalate. Major concern within the boardrooms of America is whether this factor is going to cloud everything else going on. Home foreclosures are mounting. The mortgage companies are knocking on doors, sending letters, making phone calls, trying to help the struggling homeowners. They'd rather modify the loan than foreclose. Critics say the lenders are making loans to borrowers who aren't creditworthy with terms that would be impossible for them to meet. Where the current wave of workouts is merely postponing foreclosures, we'll see. I got the strangest letter from my own bank just a couple of days ago. I have a Visa card with my bank. the letter says, by the way, Chuck, anything that you buy in the next few months will carry 0 interest all the way to the end of the year. And I'm looking at this puzzled. If they were soliciting new business, like take our credit card and we'll do this for you, I could understand that as a promotional letter. I get 3 or 4 of those, a day from various credit card companies. This is from my own bank with a card that I already have. Why are they willing to run my interest to 0? See, I close it. I don't allow it to grow. I keep it current for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But I was puzzled. The more I thought about the letter, the more it puzzled me. There's no business reason for them to want to do that, because they're not getting anything by my doing that. They're giving away interest that I would normally be charged. Unless something behind the scenes, like the government, is finding a way for the bankers to keep the spending up by everybody. They're doing everything they can to prop up our economy between now and the election. And the banks are the front line of that, apparently. Let's talk about money supply. Money is the quantity of money within the economy to purchase things, services, and so forth. The money supply affects the interest rates inversely. The more money supply increases, the interest rates fall. And when the interest rates equates, then the money demanded with the quantity of supply, the economy is working at what's called money market equilibrium. Understand there's an economy and there's a monetary system. They aren't always in balance. But when they are in balance, then, okay, that's the way it works. Now, to measure money supply, there's a number of components. M0 is all the physical currency that we're familiar with. What's called M1, you add to that the demand accounts, like your checking accounts and so forth. Add all that up in the country, that gives you the M1. You add to that the savings account and certificate CDs and that sort of thing. You finally get to M3, and that's when you take all that plus your, repurchase agreements. And it's the broadest measure of money supply. And it's the primary yardstick of economists to understand what's going on, okay? The M3, just remember that number. Here is the money supply components, M1, M2, M3. But you'll notice something kind of interesting. That effective in March of 2005, the Federal Reserve has decided that they're not going to publish the M3 anymore. Now they have the silly reasons for claiming they're not doing it. They're just deciding not to make manifest their report card. Imagine if I was the chairman of a major public company and I announced to the shareholders, by the way, guys, you're not going to get an annual report this year. There'd be an uproar. That's expected. That's their accountability. Federal Reserve's decided not to let you know how well they're doing at pumping the well. During the 18 years that Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve, our dollar fell in half. 18 years, it grew to 50% of value. With Bernanke in place, it's destined for lots of reasons to fall a lot further. There will be inflation, whether they'll admit it or not. And this is one way of hiding it for as long as they can. There are other indicators. See, it's not publishing the M3. And your personal stewardship for your families really require you to maintain surveillance of what is going on vis-a-vis the possibility of inflation ahead. Lots of denials in the press. You read these inane panelists on TV, and it's clear they don't get it. But you need to get it. You need to understand what's coming to position yourself. One of the fears is hyperinflation. What do we mean by that? Well, let's take Germany 1920. Food prices doubled every 49 hours. My grandparents sold their restaurant to retire. When they entered escrow, the value of that restaurant was enough for them to retire on. When the escrow closed, what they got was enough to buy a loaf of bread. See, in 1920, a loaf of bread cost 1 mark. By 1923, it cost 726 million marks in 3 years. You and I have no capacity to imagine the trauma of that kind of hyperinflation. In Russia in the 1990s, similar kind of thing. 1994, 100 rubles to the dollar. 1990, within 5 years, 30,000 rubles to the dollar. You can understand the disruption that causes in the economy. It destroys the economy. In the United States, we are now the largest debtor in the world, and our interest rates are not going to go down. They're going to go up. There are presently $48 trillion in debt instruments floating around. People are talking about the end of money. The money supply In 354 years of the history of this country, even before it was a country, the total money supply for 354 years was less than $1 trillion total. In 2006, in 10 months, we needed an extra trillion. We didn't need as much additional currency as we needed in the previous 3 centuries. Total credit market debt in 1975 was about $5 trillion. From 2004 to 2006, just in those 2 years, it increased by that much, $5 trillion. It now totals over $51 trillion in total. These are numbers so large, they're hard to embrace. Household debt has doubled in the past 6 years. Now, to give you, what's disturbing about all these trends is that the slope itself is increasing. The rate of increase is increasing. That's called exponentiation. It isn't long before it goes totally unstable. But there's something else that is not being tracked that I want to call to your attention. An unseen leverage. They're called derivatives, is the general term for it. They're hidden behind the scenes. What is a derivative? Well, it's an investment that derives its value from something else, from some underlying instrument. In other words, you have an instrument that its value depends on some other instrument. How? By an option, a warrant, futures. Those are all derivative investments. Also convertibles, things that can convert to a derivative are derivatives. Now, the widespread use of derivatives throughout the world have multiplied the risks in the financial markets. The U.S. derivative market today is 8 times larger than the entire economy. The gross domestic product of the United States, multiply that by 8, and you got an approximation of the derivative market. In 1995, commercial banks alone had $17.5 trillion in derivatives. By 2004, it had escalated from 17.5 to 75.5 trillion, a 235% increase in 10 years. Say, gee, that's 23% a year. No, it's actually worse than that because the percent per year is increasing. It's between 20 and 30% per year growing. Now, what's disturbing about this whole world is 90% of these are traded over the counter with no records. You can only guess, make estimates, because it's an unregulated market. It's over the counter. Not all of them, 90%. 10% are regulated, but 90% are not. The total guess at the market is over $400 trillion, 10 times the total indebtedness of the U.S. government. Now, banks are the most fearful, or I should say fearsome, users of these. In 2004, there's about 39 trillion. That's 4 times the U.S. gross domestic product. There's about 11.5 trillion here in the estimates. In 1 year, it went from 39.6 to 76.5, held by banks. Now, what the controller of the currency of the United States points out to us, that of those banks, that the 76.5 trillion derivatives was backed only by 715 billion in equity. In other words, less than 1% is backed hard. That's all leverage. That is unbelievable leverage to be able to put down 0.9% of the risk to get the gain. 7 banks hold 96% of the derivative holdings, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citibank. The 3 of them hold about 3 times the GDP. And when these banks merge, it increases the risks, by the way. That's something that's causing a lot of concern. Let's just take one example. The long-term capital management is a name you probably have not heard unless you follow the financial play. It's a company that employs maybe a couple hundred employees. In 1998, this hedge fund called LTCM had $100 billion in assets, $4 billion in cash. It used that as collateral for $1.2 trillion in derivatives. Well, among those derivatives were some Russian bonds. When they collapsed, they were in trouble. They were in such trouble. Here's the interesting part. The Federal Reserve panicked and had to intervene to avoid what they felt would be a complete meltdown of the whole U.S. financial system. One company, a company you've never heard of, that employs about 200 people, could bring down the whole U.S. financial structure? You got to be kidding. No, that was the assessment of the Federal Reserve. They actually connived to get this thing fixed, off the table, so to speak. And we could go on with lists of companies, Enron, WorldCom, these huge corporate failures. The root problem was the derivatives. Well, let's shift and let's hear it from David Walker. This is not a fringe guy. This is not some guy trying to publish a book or a newsletter on the television talk shows. He's the Comptroller General of the United States. He's publicly expressed his professional opinion that the American public needs to tell Washington it's time to steer the nation off the path to financial ruin. Quote, what they don't talk about is the dirty little secret everyone in Washington knows, or at least should. The vast majority of economists and budget analysts agree the ship of state is on a disastrous course and will founder on the reefs of economic disaster if nothing is done to correct it. That's the official word from the guy that knows most about it, David Walker. His basic message is that the United States government conducts business as usual over the next few decades. A national debt that is already $8.5 trillion could reach $46 trillion or more, adjusted for inflation. A hole that big could paralyze the U.S. economy. According to some projections, just the interest payments on the debt that big would be as much as all the taxes of the government collects today. Just the interest, not all the other costs. Every year that nothing is done, the problem grows by $2 to $3 trillion per year. Let's take a look at the official report published in December 16th of 2006. It says that the federal budget deficit was $4.6 trillion, not the previously reported $248 billion. Only, what's 1,000 difference? The difference is that the typical Treasury Department report of federal deficit is on a cash basis where the tax receipts are applied when received to current liabilities. However, here's the point that's interesting. The financial report of the United States is calculated on a GAAP basis. What's a GAAP basis? That's what's commonly known to your accountants as the generally accepted accounting principles. Any formal report of any kind to shareholders is GAAP. Generally is done at GAAP. If you take the United States reports on a GAAP basis, it gets interesting. That means accruals are made for the current year changes in the net present value of unfunded liabilities in social insurance programs such as Social Security and Medicare. Okay, what does that mean? The report shows that on the GAAP accounted negative net worth of the federal government has increased to $53.1 trillion, while the total federal obligations under GAAP accounting now total $54.6 trillion, taking into account the present value of the future Social Security and Medicare liabilities. Here's the punchline. Put simply, their words. The 2006 financial report of the United States shows that the arguments that the U.S. government is bankrupt have increasing merit. What was that? U.S. government is bankrupt? Technically. That's the U.S. government talking, not some critic on the sidelines. That bother you? This is from the official financial report by the U.S. Treasury, December 15th, 2006. Okay, a summary of these threats. We talked about Magog, Middle East escalation in general, Al-Qaeda sequel, everybody's waiting for it. Homeland Security is sweating that one. We have inside reason to believe the number one priority among Homeland Security isn't Al-Qaeda, it's the EMP attack. The U.S. debt debacle, we've just told you half the story. Let's go on a little bit. There's an international competitive aspect that's going to crush us. What about this talk about a North American Union? And what's this talk about a new currency called the Amero? That's scheduled by the Council for Foreign Relations, presumably by 2010. What's all that about? In 1770, Sir William Pitt said to Britain's House of Lords, there's something behind the throne greater than the king himself. And from that phrase, that introduced in the English language this strange expression, the power behind the throne. Or another vernacular, things are not what they seem. That the politics you see is theater. The real power is behind the scenes. What does it mean? That a self-appointed elite manipulates and guides the direction of governments today, operating beneath the public radar, constantly reinventing themselves and craftily doing end runs around any legislative and judicial regulations blocking their self-serving goals. Felix Frankfurter, the U.S. Supreme Court Justice, has gone on record. He says the real rulers in Washington are invisible and exercise power from behind the scenes. You ever wondered why it seems to make no difference which political office, which political party's in office? Doesn't seem to make any difference, does it? President Bush signed a formal agreement that will end the United States as we know it. And he took the step without approval from either the U.S. Congress or the people of the United States. It's an absolute contravention of our law, of our Constitution and every national value, and that has been echoed by many commentators, not the least of which was Lou Dobbs and others. The global elite, through the direct operation of the President George Bush and his administration, are creating a North American Union that will combine Canada, Mexico, and the United States into a superstate called the North American Union, roughly patterned after the European Union. There is no political or economic mandate for creating the NAU, and unofficial polls of the cross-section Americans indicate that they are overwhelmingly against this end run around national sovereignty. That was in the August Review of November last year. Have you noticed all this talk about the border? The Republicans and Democrats are throwing rocks at each other for everything you can imagine, but no one is really calling it by what's really going on. Associated Press points out that 98% of those arrested between October 1st, 2000 and September 30th, 2000, or a 5-year period, were never prosecuted for illegally entering the country. Nearly 5.3 million immigrants were simply escorted back across the Rio Grande and turned loose, and presumably they'll slip back later. The number of immigrants prosecuted annually tripled during the 5-year period to 30,000, the most recent figures available, but still represented less than 3% of the 1.17 million arrests made in 2005. The prosecution rate was just under 1%. What's going on here? According to the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the likelihood of an illegal immigrant being prosecuted is, to me, practically zero. There is no intent of the administration to fix this problem because there's a hidden agenda. Let's get back to this North American Union that is unofficially being promoted behind the scenes with cabinet officers participating in committees to make it happen. They talk about the Amero, a new currency, a common currency to replace the US dollar, the Canadian dollar, and the Mexican peso. When you hear these things, as I first heard this some years ago, I dismissed it as, well, that's conspiracy talk, that's just extremists, utopian planners, what have you. No, it's getting more and more serious. Anyone that analyzes this, and by the way, according to the architect for all of this is a guy by the name of Robert Pastor, who's director of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's published books on this. They're following his agenda. They're building the superhighway. All that's in our thing. I can't take all the time to get in here now, except point out this. In order to get the Amero in, it will take a major economic crisis. It would require massive U.S. debt, unbridled credit expansion, and a prospect of a major property collapse in order to create the crisis that would allow this kind of thing to be introduced. Then it hits you between the eyes. They're going to prop up our economy through the election, 2008, for sure. That's understandable. But according to the CFR experts, they're planning to introduce this about 2010. So there's a 2-year window that we can expect something interesting to happen. Is it possible that the very crisis required is actually being deliberately designed as we speak? We don't know. The scripture says a prudent man foresees the evil and hideth himself, but the simple pass on and are punished. So the question is, okay, we've talked about a lot of these things. We've just touched scratched the surface. You can get our total collection of 4 DVDs on this to go over all this stuff. But the real question it'll beg is, what do we do? Great, Chuck. What's the so what question? What do we do about this? The so what question. You and I can't change the course of history. I'm not suggesting we go to Washington, and I'm not suggesting we shouldn't. Obviously, we should have our voices heard. But I wouldn't bank my personal family's future on our ability to change the course of history. So what do? We can exercise prudence in our own personal and family preparations for whatever's coming. What does that mean? See, we don't know whether there's going to be deflation or inflation, uncertainty, and that leads to what we call the Vortex strategy. So part 2 of this briefing will be our action plan in view of these uncertainties. See you in the next session.